Sorry for that quick ending on the last one. My dog started barking at me. She was starving to death. Alright, so we figured out how to close those things. So we have two kinds of funds going on within the proprietary funds. The categories are internal service funds and enterprise funds. So first of all, what's an internal service fund? Well, we know that what makes something a proprietary fund is that it's generating its own revenues, it's self-supporting, it's like a business. So an internal service fund is serving the government. So imagine things like a motor pool, a print shop that just does all the printing for the city, whether you're the water department, the courthouse, whatever you are, the police department, they just do all the printing. Janitorial services, maybe purchasing services. They're earning their revenues from the other departments. So typically, like a purchasing department will do all the purchases for, say, the whole city, all the departments across the board, and then they'll mark them up like by 30% to pay for their overhead and kind of sell it to the other departments. And that way they can, get economies of scale, make bigger purchases. It's just better sometimes, not always. So an internal service fund, it's kind of just like the name implies. It's providing services within the government. Alright, so it's just more efficient that way to have one motor pool than to have the police department have one, the fire department have one, the city have one, the library have one, right? They just use one pool of cars. Alright. And they charge those departments. So the internal service fund, whatever it is, let's say it's the printing office, they charge those departments. Alright, so here's some example. Motor pool, communications, maintenance, purchasing, supplies, insurance, and risk management. So I want to talk, it's pretty easy to comprehend this motor pool or supplies purchasing. But what's self-insurance and risk management? So some cities, states, things like that, because they can levy taxes, because in some cases they can't be sued. If you trip on a sidewalk and break your leg, you may not actually be able to sue the city. You have to be given permission to sue a government. So they don't necessarily buy insurance like the rest of us do for liability. They do what's called self-insured. So that just means we're going to set aside some money to handle issues that would normally get paid through an insurance claim. Right? So if the governmental entity self-insures or has risk management funds, they can choose between using the general fund, right, or an internal service fund for these activities. Because when you think about it, and if they self-insure, that's kind of like having an insurance agency in-house. So it could be an internal service fund, or they can stick it under general fund, either one. If they use an internal service fund, the premiums that those other branches of the government pay is treated like a revenue. The other funds that are using their services treat it like it's either an expense or an expenditure. So if it's a governmental fund, they would call that premium an expenditure when they pay for it. Or if it's like the water department, they would just call it an expense when they pay for it. And if you're the ISF that does the insuring, you call that your revenue. Alright, so what's an enterprise fund? An enterprise fund is used for sales of services primarily outside the government. So this is stuff you sell and make revenues off of. So like water, electricity. You really don't sell police services, right? So that would be in the general fund typically. They are separate, and you have to have a separate enterprise. So you could, let's say you ran a small water department, you could stick it in the general fund if it wasn't very large, but sometimes cities or states or governments, school districts, whatever, issue bonds or debt, and they pledge the revenues from that enterprise to pay it back, right? So you can imagine the city does a big bunch of capital improvements to the water lines, and they dig up all the water, and it costs millions of dollars. So they issue a bond to do it. And in order to get people to buy the bond, they say, well, this bond is going to be paid back with the revenues from the water department. So that money that we earn, we're going to use it to pay back the bonds. So if you have one of those kind of bonds, or a loan from the bank, you can certainly pledge your revenues to the bank. Now you have to keep a separate enterprise fund for that water department. Okay, so if you have debt backed by that, you have to keep a separate enterprise fund. If you're legally required to charge fees that will recover costs, you have to have a separate fund so those fees can be kept up with. Or if the government just has a policy of requiring cost recovery from fees. Now, a separate enterprise fund is not mandatory but permitted if none of those three things are going on. You're required to keep track of it for some reason. If you're not required to keep track of it, you still can if you want to see the net cost or to the city. So what does this mean? Well, you may not want to use a separate enterprise fund for the swimming pool that's only open June, July, and August, and you charge $2 per kid to come in and swim, and maybe you have some kids that are lifeguards, and it can just be part of the governmental fund. I mean, it just depends on the government. If it's it's kind of self-supporting, but it's not really a very big deal, right? So you don't have to use an enterprise fund if it doesn't require it, as talked about before. So, as we've talked about all along, these are the kind of things where you have a separate enterprise fund, and each one would have its own fund, and it would be titled, water utilities fund, gas or electric fund, airport fund. So you might have columns on your financial statements for each one of these funds: a hospital, a parking garage, toll roads, public housing. All would be what we'd call enterprise funds. And so they would be under the enterprise funds columns and on the proprietary funds balance sheet and statement of net position. All right. So these enterprise funds, so the water department, the electric company, gas department, they can issue bonds themselves typically that will help them do capital improvements. You need to do some new power lines. You need, maybe you want to build a new pool. Maybe you are doing an enterprise fund for your pool. You want to build a new airport. Okay, well, it's going to be its own self-supporting enterprise, so it goes in an enterprise fund, right? So if it's a capital project that's not self-supporting, it goes in governmental, right? But if it's a self-supporting thing, you're an airport, you're going to charge the airline fees to use the airport, and passengers are going to pay a fee to come and go. It's self-supporting, so it goes as an enterprise fund. So in order to build these things, or improve these things, or run these things, whatever it is you're wanting to get money for, they might issue bonds. So of course that's a form of debt sold to the public. People buy them because they a lot of times have some tax advantages. So anyway, there's two general kinds of bonds that can be issued. One's a revenue bond, and a revenue bond is a bond that's issued, and part of the debt covenants for that bond is they'll be paid back with the money from that enterprise. So if you're going to do a big water redo, and you're going to redo the pipes and all the new water mains and make it all fancy and nice, do a new water treatment facility, and you issue revenue bonds, those bonds will be paid back out of the revenues from the water department. There's also general obligation bonds, and those are backed by the full faith and credit of the whole government. So if the water department belongs to the city of Kingsville and they issue bonds that are general obligation bonds, those are going to get paid back by the city of Kingsville, whether the water department makes money or not. All right. So sometimes general obligation bonds are used to finance enterprise activities, so not a capital project, right? So they may do that to get a better credit rating, which means lower interest, right? And if it's just a formality, the bonds are still listed as a liability in that enterprise fund. If the government, so right, in other words, they're just so it's really the issue of this general obligation bond is for the enterprises, is for the water department, the enterprise fund. These are going to be for the water department to run stuff. It's not a capital project, so it's not forced under the water department. It's just some money to help them run stuff. Typically, if they're just doing it as a formality, in other words, these are general obligation bonds because we'll get a better credit rating. We're just calling them that. So they put them under the enterprise fund. But, in other words, the enterprise fund itself is really going to pay them back. It's just not called a revenue, right? It's just not called a revenue bond, all right? But it's really a revenue bond. They're really going to pay it back with revenues. But if it's like the city itself is going to pay it back from its own funds regardless, then you typically will put that in the governmental funds. All right. So we have a few more things to finish up. So when we come back, we'll talk about a few more things, and then we'll be done with Chapter 6.